On a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a small suburban neighborhood, a 68-year-old retired high school principal walked into Wilson's corner store, just as he had done every week for the past 15 years. With his worn leather wallet in one hand and a small shopping list in the other, he made his way through the familiar aisles, picking up his usual items, fresh bread, milk, and his favorite newspaper. The store was relatively empty, save for a few regular customers and Mrs. Chen, the friendly cashier who had known him since she started working there. The elderly man, dressed in his characteristic neat sweater vest and pressed slacks, took his time selecting his items, occasionally stopping to check the expiration dates with his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. As he reached for the last item on his list, a young police officer strutted into the store. The officer, who was new to the precinct and eager to assert his authority, immediately began scrutinizing everyone in sight. His demeanor was noticeably different from the community-oriented approach of other local officers who regularly patrolled the area. The elderly man, absorbed in reading the ingredient list on a can of soup, didn't notice the officer approaching him from behind. Without warning or provocation, the officer's voice boomed through the quiet store, "Sir, what are you doing here? I need to see some ID right now." The sudden demand caught everyone's attention. Mrs. Chen stopped mid-scan at her register, and the few other customers turned to watch the scene unfold. The elderly man, startled but maintaining his composure, slowly turned around. Years of experience as an educator had taught him how to handle tense situations with dignity. "Officer," he began calmly, "I'm simply doing my weekly shopping, as I have been for the past 15 years in this store." His voice was steady, carrying the same authoritative tone he had used during his 35 years as a principal. The officer, seemingly annoyed by the calm response, pressed further. "That's not what I asked. Show me your ID, or we're going to have a problem." His hand rested suggestively on his belt, an unnecessary show of force that didn't go unnoticed by the other customers. What the officer didn't realize was that this elderly man wasn't just any retired principal. He had spent decades building relationships in the community, mentoring countless students who had gone on to become successful professionals, including several police officers, lawyers, and even the current mayor. Mrs. Chen, unable to stay silent any longer, stepped out from behind her counter. "Officer, this gentleman is a regular customer and a respected member of our community. There's absolutely no need for dash." The officer cut her off sharply. "Ma'am, please stay out of this. This is official police business." His dismissive tone echoed through the store, creating an even more uncomfortable atmosphere. The elderly man, still maintaining his dignified composure, reached for his wallet. As he did so, he noticed something that brought a slight smile to his face. Through the store window, he could see a familiar car pulling into the parking lot. It was Police Chief Thompson, one of his former students from 20 years ago. Still, he took out his ID and handed it to the officer, saying quietly, "Here you go, officer." "Though I must say, in my 35 years as the principal of Springfield High School, I've learned that respect goes both ways." The young officer snatched the ID, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. He was so focused on trying to find something wrong that he didn't notice the store's door opening behind him, or the heavy footsteps approaching. Just as the officer opened his mouth to make another unnecessary comment, a deep, authoritative voice rang out. "Is there a problem here?" Chief Thompson's presence filled the small store, his eyes taking in the scene before him with growing concern. The young officer's demeanor changed instantly, his back stiffening as he recognized his superior's voice. The situation was about to take an unexpected turn, and the smug confidence that had been radiating from the young officer just moments ago began to fade. The tension in the air was palpable as Chief Thompson walked closer, his eyes moving between his subordinate and his former principal. The story of what happened next would soon become a powerful lesson about respect, authority, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their age or appearance. Chief Thompson's presence brought an immediate shift to the atmosphere in Wilson's corner store. His eyes fell on the elderly man's ID still clutched in the young officer's hand, and his expression softened with recognition and respect. "Mr. Johnson," the chief said warmly, stepping forward to shake the elderly man's hand. "It's been too long since our last community board meeting. I hope Officer Richards here wasn't giving you any trouble?" His tone carried a hint of concern as he glanced at his subordinate. The young officer's face had drained of color as he realized his grave mistake. Not only was he confronting a respected community member, but someone his own chief clearly knew well. He quickly tried to hand the ID back, nearly dropping it in his haste. "Chief, I was just conducting a routine check." Officer Richards began, but Chief Thompson raised his hand, cutting him off. "A routine check of a man buying groceries in broad daylight?" The chief's voice was calm but carried unmistakable disappointment. "A man who, I might add, wrote me a letter of recommendation for the police academy 20 years ago?" The other customers in the store had stopped pretending to shop and were now openly watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Chen stood nearby, arms crossed, a look of satisfaction on her face as she witnessed justice being served through proper channels. The elderly man adjusted his glasses and spoke with the same measured tone he'd used with troubled students throughout his career. "Chief Thompson, if I may? Perhaps this could be a learning opportunity. When I was principal, I found that the best lessons often came from our mistakes, not our successes." Chief Thompson nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the familiar wisdom in his former principal's words. "You taught me that very lesson when I was in your office for fighting in the 10th grade. It changed my life's direction." Turning to Officer Richards, whose discomfort was now plainly visible, the chief continued, "Officer, do you know why I became a police officer?" "No, sir," Richards replied quietly, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I was a troubled kid in high school, heading down the wrong path. But Mr. Johnson here saw something in me worth saving. Instead of expelling me after that fight, he made me volunteer with the local police department's youth program. That experience showed me what real community policing looks like." The elderly man smiled at the memory. "You were quite a handful back then, but I never doubted your potential." Chief Thompson addressed the young officer again, his voice firm but instructive. "Being a police officer isn't about throwing our weight around or assuming the worst in people. It's about serving our community, protecting our neighbors, and building trust." Mrs. Chen, who had been quiet during this exchange, stepped forward. "Chief Thompson, Mr. Johnson has been shopping here for 15 years. He reads to children at the library every Saturday and organizes the annual community food drive. Everyone in this neighborhood knows him." The revelation seemed to make Officer Richards shrink even further into himself. The chief noticed this and placed a hand on his shoulder. "The badge we wear isn't just a symbol of authority, it's a symbol of responsibility and trust. We earn respect by giving it." The elderly man cleared his throat softly. "If I may suggest, Chief, perhaps Officer Richards would benefit from spending some time with our community youth program? We're always looking for officers to mentor our young people." Chief Thompson's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's an excellent idea. In fact, Officer Richards, starting next week, you'll be assigned to community outreach. You'll be working with Mr. Johnson and other community leaders to understand the neighborhood you're supposed to protect and serve." Officer Richards looked up, surprised by this turn of events. Instead of punishment, he was being offered a chance to learn and grow. "Yes, sir," he said, this time with genuine respect in his voice. The elderly man began gathering his scattered shopping items, and Mrs. Chen hurried to help him. "Your groceries are on the house today, Mr. Johnson," she insisted. "That's very kind, Mrs. Chen, but I'll pay as usual," he replied with a gentle smile. "It's important to maintain our normal routines, especially after unusual situations." As the elderly man completed his purchase, Chief Thompson shared quiet words with Officer Richards, who nodded repeatedly, his expression showing emerging understanding. The other customers gradually returned to their shopping, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a sense that they had witnessed something important, not just the humbling of an arrogant officer, but a moment of teaching and transformation. Before leaving the store, the elderly man turned to Officer Richards. "Young man, I hope you'll stop by the community center this Saturday. We're having our monthly breakfast meeting, and it would be good for you to meet the people you serve. Sometimes the best way to protect a community is to become part of it first." The officer, looking genuinely contrite, nodded. "I'll be there, sir. And I'm sorry about my behavior earlier." As the elderly man walked out of the store with his groceries, Chief Thompson following to continue their conversation, Mrs. Chin noticed Officer Richard standing quietly, seemingly deep in thought. She couldn't help but think that sometimes the best lessons in life come wrapped in moments of humility, and that true authority comes not from a badge or uniform, but from the wisdom to know how to wear them with honor and respect. Saturday morning arrived with golden sunshine streaming through the windows of the community center. Officer Richards stood at the entrance, adjusting his civilian clothes nervously. He had deliberately chosen not to wear his uniform today, understanding that building trust required meeting people on equal ground. Inside, the community breakfast was in full swing. The large room buzzed with conversation and laughter as neighbors shared plates of homemade pancakes, eggs, and fresh fruit. The elderly man was at the center of it all, moving from table to table with the energy of someone half his age, making sure everyone felt welcome. When Officer Richards finally gathered the courage to walk in, he was struck by the diversity of the gathering. There were families with young children, elderly couples, teenagers helping with serving, and local business owners all mingling together. This was the community he had been policing, but he realized he had never really seen it before. The elderly man spotted him and made his way over, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I'm glad you came," he said, handing 1 cup to Richards. "Come, there are some people you should meet." Over the next hour, Richards was introduced to dozens of community members, each with their own story. He met Mrs. Parker, an 80-year-old who ran a free tutoring program from her living room. There was Mr. Rodriguez, who had transformed an empty lot into a thriving community garden. And young Tyler, a teenager who once got into trouble but was now helping organize sports programs for neighborhood kids. As they talked, the elderly man shared stories of his years as a principal, and Richards began to understand the deep web of relationships that made this community strong. "You see," the elderly man explained, watching a group of children play nearby, "every person here has something valuable to contribute. Our job, yours as an officer and mine as a community leader, is to help them feel safe and supported enough to share those gifts." The conversation was interrupted by Chief Thompson's arrival. He joined them with a warm smile, carrying a folder under his arm. "Officer Richards, I've been working on your new community engagement assignment. Starting Monday, you'll be partnering with our youth basketball program." Richards looked surprised. "Basketball, sir?" The elderly man chuckled. "Sports have a way of breaking down barriers. When you're on the court, it doesn't matter what uniform you wear or what title you hold. It's about trust, teamwork, and respect." A young boy approached their table, looking nervously at Richards. "Are you really a police officer?" he asked. Richards nodded, and to his surprise, the boy's face lit up. "Cool. We need more players for our basketball game. Want to play?" Before Richards could respond, the elderly man gave him a gentle nudge. "Go on. This is what community policing really looks like." For the next hour, Richards found himself playing basketball with a mixed group of kids and teenagers. As he ran up and down the court, he felt his preconceptions melting away. These weren't potential troublemakers to be watched, they were just kids who needed positive role models and safe spaces to grow. During a water break, he overheard 2 elderly women discussing a recent series of minor vandalism incidents in the neighborhood. Instead of immediately jumping into police mode, he listened. They weren't just complaining, they were discussing ways to engage the local youth in community art projects to give them creative outlets. Chief Thompson watched from the sidelines with the elderly man. "Your method always works better than punishment," he admitted. "I learned that from you years ago." The elderly man nodded wisely. "People will surprise you with their capacity for growth when you give them the chance. Look at Officer Richards now, he's beginning to understand that authority isn't about power over people, it's about power with people." As the morning progressed, Richards found himself drawn into more conversations. He learned about the community's challenges, but more importantly, he saw how they worked together to solve problems. When someone's business struggled, others stepped in to help. When a family faced hardship, neighbors rallied around them. The elderly man watched as Richards engaged with different community members, noting how the officer's body language had changed. Gone was the rigid posture and suspicious glances. Instead, there was genuine interest and growing understanding. Near the end of the breakfast, a local news reporter who had heard about the incident at Wilson's corner store approached the elderly man for comment. With characteristic grace, he deflected any attempt to sensationalize the story. "This isn't about one incident," he explained. "It's about building bridges and understanding. Sometimes what looks like a problem is actually an opportunity for growth." As people began cleaning up after the breakfast, Richards helped stack chairs and wipe down tables. The elderly man approached him one last time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "every day in that school, I saw young people at crossroads. The ones who succeeded weren't always the smartest or the strongest, they were the ones who were willing to learn from their mistakes." Richards nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "Sir, I've learned more about real police work this morning than I did in weeks of patrol. Thank you for not giving up on me, just like you didn't give up on Chief Thompson years ago." The elderly man smiled. "The story isn't over yet, young man. Monday starts your real training, not in law enforcement, but in community building. Are you ready for that?" As Richards looked around the community center, at the faces that were no longer strangers, he felt something shift inside him. The badge on his uniform, which he'd once seen as a symbol of authority, now felt more like a symbol of responsibility, a responsibility to protect and serve the real people whose lives and stories he was just beginning to understand. Monday morning brought new challenges and opportunities for Officer Richards. As he arrived at the Community Youth Center in his patrol car, he noticed several teenagers lounging outside, their expressions guarded as they watched him park. It was a familiar scene, but this time, he saw it through different eyes. Instead of immediately asserting his authority, he remembered the elderly man's wisdom from the community breakfast. He approached with a genuine smile, recognizing one of the boys from Saturday's basketball game. "Hey there. Ready for some basketball practice?" The tension visibly dissolved as the teenagers realized why he was there. The word spread quickly through the neighborhood that a police officer was actually playing basketball with local kids, not just patrolling the streets looking for trouble. What started as a mandatory assignment began to feel like something more meaningful. During his regular patrol hours, Richards found himself applying what he'd learned. When he spotted a group of young people gathered in front of Wilson's corner store, a sight that would have previously made him suspicious, he parked his car and joined them. To his surprise, they were helping Mrs. Chen unload her delivery truck, something they did every week. The elderly man, who happened to be buying his newspaper, watched with approval as Richards rolled up his sleeves and joined in, making the work lighter while building connections. "You see," he said to Mrs. Chen, "sometimes the best changes come from the most unexpected situations." Word of Richards' transformation spread through the department. Other officers, initially skeptical of this soft approach to policing, couldn't deny the results. The number of confrontational incidents in his patrol area dropped significantly. Young people who used to scatter at the sight of a police car now waved hello. One afternoon, a call came in about a disturbance at the community garden. In the past, Richards would have arrived with lights flashing, ready to assert control. Instead, he pulled up quietly and assessed the situation. He found two elderly residents in a heated argument over garden plots and water usage. Drawing on his recent experiences, Richards didn't immediately try to take charge. Instead, he listened to both sides, then suggested they all sit down with Mr. Rodriguez, the garden coordinator. Within an hour, not only was the dispute resolved, but the three of them were sharing gardening tips and planning a community harvest festival. Chief Thompson, who had been monitoring Richards' progress, shared the story at the next police department meeting. "This is what community policing looks like," he announced to the room full of officers. "It's not about the number of arrests or citations. It's about preventing problems by being part of the solution." The elderly man's influence extended beyond just Officer Richards. He was invited to speak at the police academy about community relations, sharing his experiences both as a former principal and as someone who had turned a potentially negative incident into a catalyst for positive change. During one of these sessions, a cadet asked him about the incident at the store. "Weren't you angry? Didn't you want to file a complaint?" The elderly man's response resonated throughout the room: "Anger is easy. Understanding is harder. But understanding is what creates lasting change." Officer Richards didn't need punishment, he needed perspective. And now he's helping others gain that same perspective. Back in the neighborhood, Richards' daily interactions continued to evolve. He started attending community council meetings, not as security, but as an active participant. He learned about local issues firsthand and helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and residents. One day, while having coffee at Wilson's corner store, Richards overheard two elderly customers discussing recent car break-ins in their area. Instead of simply taking notes for a report, he engaged them in conversation. Together, they developed a neighborhood watch program that combined traditional policing with community involvement. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed the original incident that started it all, marveled at the change. "It's like watching a garden grow," she told the elderly man during one of his regular visits. "From something unpleasant, look what has bloomed." The elderly man's approach had created a ripple effect. Other precincts began sending their officers to community engagement programs. The local news, which had initially wanted to report on police misconduct, now ran a feature story about the innovative community policing program that was transforming neighborhood relations. During one basketball practice, Richards found himself coaching alongside the elderly man. As they watched the teenagers play, the former principal shared another piece of wisdom: "You know, in all my years in education, I learned that the best teachers are often those who are willing to become students again." Richards nodded, understanding deeply now. "I thought this assignment was some kind of punishment," he admitted. "But it's been the best education I've ever received." The elderly man smiled. "That's because you were ready to learn. The badge gives you authority, but it's your actions that earn you respect. You've learned to see the community as partners, not suspects." As they watched the sun set over the basketball court, the sounds of laughter and squeaking sneakers filling the air, both men reflected on how far things had come. What had started as a moment of disrespect had transformed into a powerful lesson about dignity, understanding, and the true meaning of community service. As autumn leaves began to color the neighborhood streets, the impact of what had started as a tense encounter in a corner store continued to grow in unexpected ways. The elderly man's wisdom and Officer Richards' transformation had sparked a movement that was reshaping the relationship between law enforcement and the community. One crisp morning, Chief Thompson called Richards into his office. The young officer, who now carried himself with quiet confidence rather than aggressive authority, found not just his chief waiting, but also representatives from 3 neighboring police departments. "Officer Richards," Chief Thompson began, "these departments have heard about our community engagement program. They'd like to understand how a single incident at Wilson's corner store led to such significant changes in community relations." Richards glanced at the commendation letters on the chief's desk, not for arrests made or tickets issued, but for community impact. He thought carefully before speaking. It wasn't just about that incident, he explained. It was about learning to see the community through different eyes. He shared stories about the basketball program, which had grown from a handful of kids to over 50 regular participants. He talked about how elderly residents now called him directly when they needed help, not because he was a police officer, but because they trusted him as a person. The elderly man, who had been invited to join the meeting, listened from his seat by the window. His presence still commanded respect, but there was also warmth in the way he surveyed the room full of law enforcement officials. The real change, Richards continued, happened when we stopped seeing our role as just enforcing laws and started seeing it as being part of the community's story. Every person we interact with has their own history, their own challenges, their own dreams. One of the visiting captains leaned forward. But how do you maintain authority while being so involved? The elderly man cleared his throat softly. May I? When everyone nodded, he stood up slowly. In my 35 years as a principal, I learned that true authority doesn't come from fear or force. It comes from trust. Officer Richards didn't lose authority by playing basketball with kids or helping at community events. He gained something more valuable, respect. That afternoon, a documentary crew from a national news network arrived to film a segment about the program. They captured footage of Richards on patrol, not just monitoring the streets but engaging with residents. They filmed him helping an elderly woman carry her groceries, chatting with teenagers at the basketball court, and attending a community planning meeting. The camera caught a particularly poignant moment when a young boy ran up to Richards's patrol car, not to report a crime, but to proudly show him a B+ on his math test. The officer's genuine joy and encouragement demonstrated exactly what community policing could be. At Wilson's corner store, Mrs. Chen had set up a community bulletin board where residents could post notices, seek help, or share good news. The store had become more than just a place to buy groceries, it was a hub of community connection, and Officer Richards made it a regular stop on his patrol. The elderly man often sat in his usual spot by the store's window, sipping coffee and observing the positive changes in his community. He watched as other officers began following Richards' example, getting out of their patrol cars more often, learning residents' names, and becoming part of the neighborhood's daily life. One day, a new family moved into the area. They were initially wary, having come from a neighborhood where police relations were strained. Their teenage son, especially, seemed to expect trouble. But within weeks, they witnessed something different here. They saw Officer Richards organizing a community cleanup day, working alongside residents to clear litter from the streets. They watched as he helped direct traffic for the community garden's harvest festival. They observed how he knew everyone's names and took time to listen to their concerns. The teenager, who had been keeping his distance, finally approached Richards during a basketball game. "My old neighborhood, it wasn't like this," he said hesitantly. "The police there, they were different." Richards nodded understanding. "I used to be different too," he admitted. "Sometimes it takes someone believing in you to help you become better." He glanced at the elderly man, who was chatting with parents on the sidelines. The success of the program attracted attention from police academies across the state. The elderly man and Officer Richards were invited to speak to new recruits about community-centered policing. They shared their story, not just the incident at the store, but the journey of transformation that followed. During one of these presentations, a cadet asked Richards if he felt the new approach made him less effective as a law enforcement officer. His response resonated throughout the auditorium: "I've learned that prevention is more powerful than punishment. When you're part of the community, you often solve problems before they become crimes." The elderly man added his perspective: "Change doesn't always come from grand gestures or official programs. Sometimes it starts with a simple choice, the choice to learn from our mistakes, to see others with compassion, and to believe in the possibility of transformation." As winter approached, the community organized a special dinner to celebrate the success of their new police-community partnership. The event was held in the high school gymnasium where the elderly man had spent so many years shaping young lives. Now, he watched as officers and residents shared meals, stories, and laughter together. Chief Thompson took the opportunity to announce that their precinct had been selected as a model for a new statewide community policing initiative. The program would be named after the elderly man, honoring his role in transforming one difficult moment into a movement for positive change. As winter melted into spring, the story of transformation that began in Wilson's corner store reached far beyond the boundaries of their small community. A National Police Chiefs Convention had invited both the elderly man and Officer Richards to share their experience as a keynote presentation. Standing in front of hundreds of law enforcement leaders from across the country, Richards felt a familiar nervousness, reminiscent of that first community breakfast months ago. The elderly man, noticing his unease, patted his shoulder reassuringly. "Just speak from your heart, like you do with the kids at the basketball court." Richards began by showing a photo of Wilson's corner store. "6 months ago, I walked into this store believing authority came from a badge and a stern voice. I couldn't have been more wrong." He shared the story of that day, not sparing himself in the telling, describing how his arrogance had nearly cost him his career, and more importantly, his chance to truly serve his community. The elderly man then took the podium, his dignified presence commanding attention without demanding it. He spoke about his years as a principal, drawing parallels between educating young minds and protecting communities. "The greatest challenge in both professions," he explained, "is not maintaining order, it's building trust." Back home, their community had become a case study in effective police-community relations. Researchers from a prestigious university had set up interviews with residents, documenting the changes they'd witnessed. Mrs. Chen shared how her store had transformed from a place where people rushed in and out to a genuine community hub. "Last week," she told the researchers, "I saw Officer Richards helping a young boy with his math homework right at that counter. The same counter where, months ago, he was demanding ID from our most respected resident." She smiled at the memory. People change when you give them the chance. The youth basketball program had expanded to include mentoring and tutoring sessions. Officers would come early or stay late to help kids with homework or just talk about their lives. The precinct's break room was now decorated with children's artwork and thank you letters from community members. One evening, while supervising basketball practice, Richards overheard 2 teenagers talking about wanting to become police officers. "But not like the old way," one said. "We want to be like Officer Richards, you know, actually part of the community." The elderly man, who was scoring the game, smiled at this overheard conversation. Later, he shared a thought with Richards, "You know, true leadership isn't about creating followers, it's about inspiring more leaders." The success of their program began attracting international attention. A delegation of police officials from several European countries visited to observe their community policing model. They were particularly impressed by how the program had grown organically from a single incident into a comprehensive approach to law enforcement. During their visit, they witnessed a scene that perfectly illustrated the transformation. A young man had been caught shoplifting at Wilson's corner store. Instead of immediately making an arrest, Officer Richards sat down with him in the store's small break room. He discovered the young man's family was struggling with food insecurity. Rather than entering the criminal justice system, the young man was connected with the community food bank and job training program. Mrs. Chen even offered him part-time work at the store. Sometimes, Richards explained to the visiting delegation, what looks like a crime is actually a cry for help. The elderly man had become a regular consultant for police departments nationwide, sharing his perspectives on community engagement. During one consultation, a skeptical police chief questioned whether this approach might make officers too soft. "Tell me," the elderly man responded, "what requires more strength, forcing compliance through fear, or building cooperation through respect?" His words resonated with many who had grown tired of the traditional us versus them approach to policing. The local high school, where the elderly man had served as principal, integrated the story into its curriculum as part of a class on civic responsibility and community engagement. Students studied how a potentially negative incident had been transformed into a catalyst for positive change. One day, a student asked Officer Richards if he regretted his actions at the store that day. His response was thoughtful: "I regret my behavior, but I'm grateful for the lesson." Sometimes our mistakes, if we're willing to learn from them, become our greatest teachers. The elderly man's influence continued to shape the community in unexpected ways. Local businesses, inspired by the police department's transformation, began implementing their own community engagement initiatives. The corner store's success had shown them that being part of the community was good for everyone. During a community council meeting, an elderly resident stood up to share her perspective: "I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never felt safer. Not because there are more police patrols, but because we finally have officers who know us, understand us, and care about us." Chief Thompson, looking back on the months since the incident, reflected on how one moment of disrespect, handled with wisdom and grace, had sparked a revolution in community policing. "We didn't just change procedures," he noted during a staff meeting. "We changed hearts, starting with our own." The elderly man's approach to conflict resolution became known as the corner store method, turning confrontation into conversation, mistakes into learning opportunities, and differences into strengths. Police academies across the country began incorporating these principles into their training programs. One afternoon, as Richards and the elderly man walked through the neighborhood they'd both helped transform, they passed Wilson's corner store. Through the window, they could see new officers chatting with customers, learning names, and building the kind of connections that had once seemed impossible. "You know," the elderly man said, pausing to watch the scene, "sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple moment of humility. What matters isn't the mistake, it's what we choose to do after." Richards nodded, understanding now more deeply than ever. The badge on his chest felt different these days, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of responsibility, service, and the continuous journey of learning and growth. 1 year had passed since that fateful day at Wilson's corner store. The neighborhood had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The annual community celebration, once a small gathering in the park, had grown into a weekend-long festival of unity and understanding, drawing visitors from neighboring cities eager to witness their success story. On a warm Saturday morning, Officer Richards stood at the center of the community park, surrounded by the very people he had once viewed with suspicion. Children darted around, wearing T-shirts that read, "Community First," while their parents set up booths showcasing local businesses and organizations that had flourished under the new community-centered approach. Mrs. Chen had expanded her corner store's influence, turning it into a community learning center after hours. The back room, where that tense confrontation had taken place a year ago, now hosted evening classes ranging from financial literacy to English as a second language. Police officers regularly volunteered as tutors, building relationships that went far beyond their traditional roles. The elderly man, despite opportunities to take his message nationwide, remained deeply rooted in the community. He could often be found in his favorite spot by the store window, mentoring young officers who sought his guidance. Every interaction, he would tell them, is an opportunity to either build a bridge or dig a trench. The choice is always yours. During the festival, a documentary filmmaker who had been following their story for the past year premiered her short film at the community center. The audience watched in rapt attention as the story unfolded on screen, from the confrontation at the store to the remarkable transformation that followed. One scene showed Officer Richards responding to a call about teenagers causing trouble at the park. Instead of arriving with sirens blaring, the footage captured him joining their basketball game, turning a potential confrontation into a teaching moment about respecting public spaces. The teenagers ended up helping him organize a park cleanup day. After the screening, a young officer from another precinct approached Richards. "I was like you once," she admitted. "Thought strength meant showing authority. But watching your journey, it's changed how I approach my job entirely." The elderly man, overhearing this conversation, smiled knowingly. He had witnessed countless such transformations over the past year. Police officers from across the country had come to learn, and each left with not just new techniques, but a new perspective on what it meant to protect and serve. The community's success had caught the attention of state legislators. They were drafting a bill, informally known as the Corner Store Initiative, that would provide funding for police departments to implement similar community engagement programs. The elderly man had been consulted in its development, ensuring the focus remained on building relationships rather than just checking boxes. One afternoon, during a break in the festival activities, Chief Thompson gathered everyone for a special announcement. The department had received a national award for innovative policing practices. But what made the moment truly special was watching Officer Richards insist that the elderly man join him in accepting it. "This award," Richard said, addressing the crowd, "isn't just about changes in policing. It's about the power of wisdom over force, understanding over authority, and the courage to admit when we're wrong." He turned to the elderly man. "You taught me that the strongest weapon any officer can have isn't on their belt, it's in their heart." The festival had attracted media attention, but not for the usual sensational headlines about police community tensions. Instead, reporters focused on the tangible results. Crime rates had dropped, community participation had soared, and most importantly, trust had been rebuilt. A touching moment came when a group of teenagers presented a mural they had created with help from local artists. It depicted the corner store transformed into a bridge, with police officers and community members walking together across it. The elderly man's figure stood at the center, his outstretched hands connecting both sides. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed the entire journey from its tense beginning, shared her perspective with a reporter. "In my 30 years running this store, I've seen many changes. But this one is different. It's not just about police and community, it's about remembering we're all human beings first." The success of their approach had led to unexpected partnerships. Local businesses had started offering internships to at-risk youth, referred by officers who now knew the community well enough to make meaningful connections. The police department's role had evolved from mere law enforcement to community advancement. During the festival's community dinner, Richard sat with some of the teenagers he'd first met on the basketball court. They were now peer mentors in the youth program, helping newer kids find positive directions for their energy. "Remember when we used to run away when we saw police cars?" one laughed. "Now we run toward them, but only if it's Officer Richards." The elderly man, watching these interactions from his table, reflected on how far they'd come. A young journalist asked him if he ever imagined such changes coming from that difficult encounter a year ago. His response was characteristically thoughtful. "When you've spent a lifetime in education, you learn that every moment has teaching potential. The key is being willing to both teach and learn." The festival's success highlighted how the community had become a model for others to follow. Visitors took notes, asked questions, and witnessed firsthand how genuine relationships between police and residents could transform a neighborhood. But more importantly, they saw how one incident, handled with wisdom and grace, could spark a movement. As the sun set on the final day of the festival, Officer Richards and the elderly man stood watching families pack up their booths and children playing one last game of basketball. The corner store's lights glowed warmly in the background, a beacon of the change that had started there. "You know," the elderly man said, "success isn't just about what we achieve. It's about what we inspire others to achieve." He gestured to the scene around them, officers chatting with residents, teenagers helping elderly neighbors carry chairs, community members from all walks of life working together to clean up after the festival. Richards nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. What had begun as his personal journey of transformation had become a blueprint for change, showing how one moment of confrontation, when met with wisdom and accountability, could lead to lasting positive change. 18 months after the incident at Wilson's corner store, the neighborhood had become a living testament to the power of transformation. On a crisp autumn morning, Officer Richards stood before a graduating class of police cadets at the State Academy, the elderly man seated proudly in the front row. "When I first put on this badge," Richards began, touching the polished metal on his chest, "I thought it gave me authority. Now I know it gives me responsibility to serve, to understand, and most importantly, to learn." The auditorium was silent, every cadet hanging on his words. The department had just released its annual statistics, showing a 70% decrease in confrontational incidents and a 45% increase in community-initiated cooperation with law enforcement. But beyond the numbers, there were the stories, countless small moments that had rebuilt trust between the police and the community they served. That afternoon, back in the neighborhood, a scene unfolded that perfectly captured the transformation. A new officer, recently transferred from another district, responded to a call at Wilson's corner store. Arriving with the old mindset of authority first, he was surprised to find Officer Richards already there, sitting at a table with two teenagers and Mrs. Chen, helping resolve a misunderstanding over a missing inventory item. "Watch and learn," Richards told his colleague quietly. "This is how we do things here." The situation was resolved not with handcuffs or threats, but with conversation and understanding. It turned out one of the teens had been trying to organize a surprise birthday party for their younger sister and had simply miscommunicated about setting aside some supplies. The elderly man, who happened to be enjoying his usual morning coffee, observed the scene with satisfaction. Later, he shared his thoughts with the new officer. "You see, young man, every incident is a crossroads. We can choose the path of confrontation or the path of conversation. The destination differs greatly depending on that choice." The community's transformation had sparked a movement that extended far beyond their neighborhood. Police departments from across the country had implemented what they now called the Wilson's Way, a comprehensive approach to community policing that emphasized relationship building over enforcement-first tactics. The corner store itself had become something of a landmark. Police training programs would bring their cadets there to learn the story firsthand. Mrs. Chen had created a small photo wall near the entrance, documenting the journey from that tense confrontation to the thriving community partnership that followed. One of the most powerful changes was visible in the young people of the neighborhood. Teenagers who had once been viewed as potential troublemakers were now active participants in community programs. Several had even expressed interest in law enforcement careers, inspired by the new model of policing they'd witnessed. At the weekly community basketball game, now a cornerstone of police community relations, Officer Richards watched as veteran officers and new recruits played alongside local residents. The elderly man, keeping score as usual, commented, "Sometimes the best way to break down walls is to never build them in the first place." The success had attracted attention from civil rights organizations and law enforcement agencies alike. They were particularly interested in how the program had managed to balance effective policing with community engagement. The elderly man's response was always the same: "It's not about finding a balance, it's about recognizing they're the same thing." During a community council meeting, a resident stood up to share a story. His son, once fearful of police, had recently called Officer Richards directly when he witnessed a crime. He didn't call because there was a police officer he could report to, the father explained, he called because there was a person he could trust. The police department had undergone its own transformation. The break room walls, once bare except for duty rosters and regulations, now displayed thank you cards from residents, photos of community events, and artwork from local children. Officers started and ended their shifts with community updates rather than just crime reports. Chief Thompson, nearing retirement, had made it his mission to ensure the changes outlived his tenure. He had worked with state officials to incorporate the community-centered approach into standard police training curriculum. "We're not just changing how we police," he explained during a training session. "We're changing why we police." The elderly man, despite his advancing years, remained an active presence in the community. He had turned down numerous offers to take his message nationwide, preferring to nurture the roots of change in his own neighborhood. Real change, he often said, is like a garden. It needs constant tending, not just occasional visits. One day, a national news crew arrived to do a follow-up story on the Miracle Precinct, as some had dubbed it. They expected to find carefully staged community programs and rehearsed success stories. Instead, they discovered authentic relationships and natural interactions between police and residents that had become so normal, they were almost unremarkable. The reporter asked Officer Richards what he would tell his younger self, the officer who had walked into Wilson's corner store that day with such a different attitude. He thought for a moment before responding, would tell him that true strength isn't in showing power, it's in showing humanity. As the story drew to a close, the elderly man prepared to pass the torch to the next generation. He had established a scholarship fund for young people interested in community-oriented careers, whether in law enforcement, education, or social services. The first recipient was the teenage boy who had once been caught shoplifting and was now preparing to enter the police academy himself. During the scholarship announcement ceremony, held fittingly at Wilson's corner store, the elderly man shared what would become his final public words of wisdom: change isn't about erasing the past, it's about using it to build a better future. Every moment of conflict carries within it the seed of transformation. Our job is simply to nurture that seed with understanding, patience, and most importantly, love. Officer Richards, standing at the back of the crowd, felt the weight of these words. He touched his badge, remembering how differently he had viewed it just 18 months ago. Now it represented not authority over a community, but responsibility to it. The incident that could have ended his career had instead given it meaning. As the ceremony concluded, the elderly man and Officer Richards shared a quiet moment in their usual spot by the store window. No words were needed. They both understood that their story was not just about a police officer learning to serve his community better. It was about the endless possibility for positive change that exists in every human heart, waiting only for the right moment, and the right wisdom, to bloom.